Hello, and welcome to another edition of Second Sunday Speaker Series. I'm Connie Swoboda, and I am here at Hartman Reserve Nature Center, which is part of Blackhawk County Conservation. And we're pleased to present Laura Walter today. Laura Walter is the Plant Materials Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center at UNI. Laura's role in native seed production furthers the center's mission of empowering people to value and restore diverse, resilient tallgrass prairie. Her work allows her to observe and photograph diverse prairie plants at all life stages, along with the numerous insects and other animals that use the center's plantings as habitat. Now today, we're going to join Laura as she shares her observations and photos, they're gorgeous photos, and explains how the center's programs and projects help to make Iowa Source prairie seed available for bringing prairies back to our roadsides, farms, parks, and gardens. Everybody, please welcome Laura Walter.
Hello, thanks for the introduction, Connie. As a member of the Board of Friends of Hartman Reserve also, and as a Cedar Valley community member for over 20 years, I first want to thank the staff of Hartman Reserve and Blackhawk County Conservation and all the people who have contributed time, energy, and funds to the Friends organization over the years. By enabling our communities to connect to nature, your work deeply enriches us all. Thank you also for the chance to share with you today about my work at the Tallgrass Prairie Center and the many natural history observations that I've made while working with native plants. One of the things that has sustained me through this pandemic is my connection to other living things, both at my workplace and in the little pockets of nature I pass through on my daily walks to work. As I talk with you today, I hope that it sometimes feels almost as if we're taking a walk together and stopping to talk about some of the things that we find. Today, I'll start with some of the prairie roots that brought me to where I am today. Next, I'll introduce you to the work that I do at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. And finally, I'll share with you some of the pictures that I take of the plants and animals that I observe in my work in the field over 3 seasons here. First, I want to give a disclaimer, and that is that the final section is going to include pretty pictures of plants and animals that are, considered beautiful commonly. But I'm also fascinated by all of the different ways that living things interact, and that includes things like predators and parasites. And so images of those kind of grittier sides of life are also going to be included. This is the kind of landscape that shaped me as I grew up. I spent much of my childhood and my early adulthood in the Flint Hills upland region of Kansas, where prairies, generally used as cattle pastures, are just a short bike ride or a long walk from wherever I lived. I was blessed to have parents who loved gardening and nature, and to grow up in a time and a place where I had abundant freedom to explore. To this day, when I need solitude or a place that settles my mind and allows me to think, I go outside and I gravitate to prairie. Before European settlement, most of Iowa was covered with tallgrass prairie. These plants and their root systems took the crushed rock deposited by glaciers and turned it into the deep, fertile soil that Iowa is famous for. An unplowed remnant prairie can contain up to 150 to 300 plant species. The variable climate, periodic fires, grazing by bison and elk help to create this diverse plant community. And in honor of today, Valentine's Day, I'd like to emphasize that Iowa is literally the heart of the Tallgrass Prairie region. However, those rich soils that they created were also the prairie's demise. They were rapidly and extensively converted to some of the world's most productive farmland. Today, only about 1,000th of the original prairie in Iowa remains. The largest remaining tracts are in the Loess Hills of far western Iowa. Across the rest of the state, the picture looks like this. Most remnants are small and isolated within a sea of crop fields. remnant prairies tend to be in places that were either too wet or too rocky or too dry for crop farming. The steep hillsides of Blackman Prairie in Butler County, where the pasque flowers bloom in April, were too rocky to plow. The sandy soils of the Cedar Hill Sand Prairie, which is aptly named, for example, were not suitable for growing crops. And the site also contains a groundwater-fed wetland called a fen that would have resisted drainage. Some remnant prairies were preserved because they were useful as cattle pastures. This one is Walters Prairie in Butler County, where there's a beautiful population of these prairie lilies. Others were on land that was protected for other reasons, like for cemeteries, or they might have been railroad rights of way. Some even remained on roadsides. Remnant prairies are precious. They're extremely important. They preserve a reference for the prairie ecosystems that built Iowa's amazing soil. They're the ultimate source of seed that will allow us to reconstruct diverse prairies for our future. They're beautiful, they're rich in life, and deserving of our awe and care. When we moved to Iowa, we had a young family, and my focus of activity was close to home. I still needed to have a connection to prairie, so together we explored nearby remnant and restored prairies, and also created a native plant garden in our backyard. These are two of my sons observing one of the monarch caterpillar, well, it's not a caterpillar anymore, one of the monarch butterflies that they reared, and watching it on butterfly milkweed. This little patch in our backyard has grown and changed in synchrony with the children who are now adults. It brings a bit of wildness into our suburban landscape, and it attracts diverse native insects and birds within view of our kitchen windows, and also the questions of our neighbors who kind of wonder what's going on. For the past 3 years, my personal and professional interests in prairie have converged in a new way. I've been working at the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa since 2018. The center was founded in 1999 under the direction of UNI biology professor Daryl Smith as the Native Roadside Vegetation Center, although some of our programs do predate that time. The center was tasked with supporting Iowa counties in using native plants to improve roadside management. We still do that work, but have added other roles and programs to evolve with changing needs and opportunities. Our mission, as Connie mentioned before, is to empower people to value and restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie. We want to expand the area of prairie in Iowa for all of the benefits that it provides for soils, water, wildlife, and people. Many of the environmental problems that are the most persistent in our state, water quality, soil loss, flooding, habitat loss, can be addressed, sometimes even cured with a prescription of prairie. We can't do this alone. We work with numerous funders, partners, and collaborators, and we look for the leverage points and the change makers within systems that influence land use. In 2021, the TPC has 4 main programs: Iowa Roadside Management, Prairie on Farms, Research and Restoration, and Plant Materials, along with some projects that cross our program boundaries and that we're all involved in, such as the Prairie Roots Project and the Urban Prairie Restoration in Benton County. The Iowa Roadside Management Program, guided by Christine Nemec, encourages counties to participate in integrated roadside vegetation management. It's quite a mouthful, but basically it supports a community of practice among roadside managers to help sustain current county roadside programs. And it supplies county roadside programs with enough native prairie seed to plant around 1,200 acres of roadsides per year across our state, mostly using seed with genetic origins in Iowa remnant prairies. Our Prairie on Farms program arose from the recognition that the overwhelming majority of the land area in Iowa is privately owned and in row crop agriculture, and that planted prairie can help offset the environmental problems that result from modern intensive farming methods. This program provides research and demonstration sites, field days and other networking events, and technical information to enable prairie planting within working landscapes. Program manager Andrew Dunham is pictured explaining the use of a Truax seed drill at a virtual field day held this fall. The Research and Restoration Program, managed by Dr. Justin Meissen, carries out research designed to test questions with direct application to restoration in our region. We strive to improve our understanding of prairie reconstruction and ecology, while at the same time putting more prairie back on the landscape. We use a combination of formal experimentation and demonstration teaching sites to answer relevant questions that land managers and decision makers have about creating and maintaining prairie plantings in many different types of situations. And I've managed the plant materials program for the past 2 years. The program's mission is to support a native seed supply for roadsides and other restorations that's diverse, regionally appropriate, source identified, and affordable. Kind of a tall order, I suppose. The program was initiated shortly after the Iowa legislature in 1988 voted to adopt more ecological management for Iowa roadsides. Suddenly, there was demand for prairie seed that needed to be diverse and adapted to Iowa conditions. Very few species of prairie seed were on the market at that time, and most of them originated outside of Iowa. Notably, some of the wildflowers that you could get at that time were being grown for the horticultural trade. And so the seed was actually coming from flower farms in Holland and places like that. Our state needed a system for encouraging seed growers here to produce Iowa source seed at the scale needed for planting several thousand acres per year. In response, the Iowa Ecotype project, supported by the Living Roadway Trust Fund, was born. All of the foundation seed produced at the TPC starts with seed collected from Iowa remnant prairies, like the Cedar Hill Sand Prairie shown in this picture. The first seed collections for the project were made in the early 1990s. It required an incredible investment of botanical knowledge, deep knowledge of those remnant prairies that remained, and sheer miles traveled. Over 30 years, those efforts netted about 3,000 seed samples of over 100 species, many of which are still stored in the freezers here on site at the TPC. The Iowa Prairie Network website defines an ecotype as a subset of a species that has adapted to a specific geographic environment, and as a result has evolved to be genetically distinct from other members of the same species found in different environments. That means that our remnant prairies hold a record of local adaptations and diversity that are basically irreplaceable. The DOT and the Iowa Roadside Management Programs made a commitment 30 years ago to use Iowa Ecotype seed wherever possible. And that meant that we needed a way to define the boundaries of ecotypes in a way that would make sense, both in terms of the biology and practical considerations, like, can you grow the seed? Can you pay for it? There were extensive discussions about this, but finally, suffice to say, the Iowa Ecotype project decided to divide the state into 3 zones north to south. And this decision was based on the importance of the north-south temperature gradient in both plant hardiness and the effects of that gradient on the timing of plant growth and flowering, such as this prairie blazing star, Leotris pycniostachya, in these images. Each of these ecotypes was at a different flower stage, even though the images were taken on the same day at the same site. To produce a regional ecotype, we grow seed from several collections from across one of those zones together in production plots. So here you can see the seed that's actually in our freezer, each one of those little vials representing one of the collections from a remnant prairie. And those, for a species within the zone, they would be pooled. We grow those out in our greenhouse to produce little plugs with nice root systems that we then transplant out into fields on the UNI campus that are managed by the Tallgrass Prairie Center. We manage those fields throughout the season and then keep monitoring them to make sure that we catch them when it's the right time to harvest each species and ecotype. Finally, we harvest the seed. You can see actually in this image, in the middle at the top there, you can see our little plot combine moving through a field of white prairie sage. Later, we bring the harvested material into a seed lab on site, and we clean that seed and package it in airtight bags after it's been dried and fully cleaned, and place that in a cold storage room, which helps to preserve its longevity over time. When they need seed to start their own production fields, native plant growers can contact us, and they use our foundation seed to start their production fields, which are at a much larger scale than our own. While we might have production plots with about 500 to 700 plants on average, commercial fields may contain over 10,000 individual plants and be measurable in acres. The seed they produce at this scale meets the needs for restoring Iowa's roadsides and supplies other restoration needs as well. Here, my colleague Christine Nemec stands among pallets of Iowa source seed that will be given to counties across Iowa who have roadside vegetation programs. The yellow tags on the bags are meaningful. They show that the seed is certified to have originated from Iowa remnant prairies. Its local adaptations and its genetic diversity should help it form long-lasting and resilient roadside prairie plantings. This partnership has helped to build a native seed market whose diversity is the envy of other regions. There are more than 100 species of Iowa-sourced native plants available in the market, and a lot of that diversity is here because of the relationship between UNI's Tallgrass Prairie Center, native seed producers, and the Iowa Department of Transportation. If you'd like to see what our native seed production looks like in any season, please come visit us. You can take a virtual tour on our website, tallgrassprairiecenter.org, and look for the maps heading. It's under the About section, and click on a link to find a story map. We also have a printable paths map made by some of our wonderful AmeriCorps service members. This map takes you through the 69 acres of UNI campus land that we manage for seed production, research, habitat, and education. Now, unlike Hartman, we don't have naturalists on staff and we can't give you a tour, but you are welcome to come and take a walk in any season. In the summer, if you see me in the plots, stop by, say hello. And in the wintertime, you might want to strap on your snowshoes or your skis before you take to the trails. Right now would be a really nice time to do that. As the Plant Materials Program Manager, I also coordinate our work in producing prairie root specimens, one of which you can see on display at the Nature Center in Hartman. We grow prairie plants in 10-foot long, 10-inch wide PVC pots that are filled with a baked clay growing medium. In about 2 to 3 years, the plant's root systems grow to lengths of between 5 and 10 feet, depending on the species. When we pull them up and open the pots, it's like Christmas in July. It's one of my favorite things to do. We often find the roots are coming out of the bottom of the pots. We preserve the roots using a glycerin solution and then hang them to dry in our greenhouse and store them in our building until they find a home in a museum or a nature center. These roots allow people to see what is normally invisible in a prairie, the life and activity that's going on below ground. The roots don't just support the plant itself, they also hold and protect soil, slow the flow of runoff and help it soak into the ground, filter pollutants from water before it reaches streams, and store carbon from the air below ground, provide habitat for soil organisms, and make it harder for weeds to invade. Wow, they do a lot. So now I'll stop making you dizzy with that GIF, sorry about that. The other project that I'm involved with that's kind of outside my program generally is the urban prairie. So much of our work at the TPC is done through empowering others, but we like getting our hands dirty too. Our staff, led by Research and Restoration Program Manager Justin Meissen, is restoring 77 acres in Benton County to Tallgrass Prairie over a 5-year period from 2018 to 2022. This land was donated to the UNI Foundation by Kathy Irvin in memory of her husband, David. And she's engaged the TPC in restoring and maintaining a diverse tallgrass prairie that will be a place for students and visitors of all ages to learn about our environmental and cultural roots. You are welcome to come and walk around the mowed paths of urban prairie to identify prairie plants, watch birds and other wildlife, or just come fly a kite. I always bring my camera. I always find good subjects for pictures, whether it's a songbird feeding on prairie seeds, the spectacular silo mural, or simply the expanse of prairie and sky. For information on planning a visit, go to tallgrassprairiecenter.org and look for urban prairie. My work at the Tallgrass Prairie Center means that I spend a large amount of my time from spring through fall outside. working in our seed production plots with my student assistant, summer teacher externs, and AmeriCorps service members. We keep a close eye on the growth of the plants because we want to produce as much healthy seed as we can. We're often crouched down among the stems, weeding, and in the process, we end up observing many surprising interactions between the plants and the animals, mostly insects that the plants support. I enjoy documenting what we find by keeping my camera handy. I've loved learning about insects since I started my first insect collection at age 10. And I probably would have studied entomology if the field hadn't been so focused on pests and killing them at the time. Many of the interactions that we observe involve insects that eat leaves, burrow into stems, suck the juices out of seeds, or even chew on flower petals, like this little tiny katydid nymph in early spring feeding on a spider wart blossom. But it's really pollinator-plant relationships that are of special interest to me. So here you can see hoverflies feeding on pollen from the stamens of a prairie rose. So here's another little nod to Valentine's Day. We'll have some pictures of roses in the presentation. Pollination is important to my current work because seed production for most wildflower species won't happen without enough of the right insects at the right time. And conserving and rebuilding pollinator populations is one of the reasons why the Tallgrass Prairie Center believes that prairie reconstruction is important. During my first summer at the TPC, I really fell in love with this plant. This is spotted Joe pieweed. It's this lovely, soft, purplish pink with an almost frothy appearance to those long-lasting flower clusters. Okay, I think I just wrote a blurb for a seed catalog, right? Its attractiveness to pollinators adds even more color. One day, we observed 7 species of butterflies nectaring on its flowers at one time. So here's one of the species we saw. These are the classic, I hope everybody knows how to identify a monarch butterfly. But the same day, we also saw an American snout. And check out that snout on that thing. You can see how it got its name. A red spotted purple. I have no idea why they call it that because it's actually more blue than purple, but oh well. A question mark. And this one is not that I don't know how to identify it and have a question about it. It literally is a question mark butterfly because of one of the markings on this hind wing. A buckeye. Silver spotted skippers. And finally, viceroy. And this one's the one that's most frequently mistaken for a monarch, but you can see it has an extra line on its hind wing. Then on another day in early August, as we were admiring the pollinators on the spotted Joe pieweed, my assistant and I noticed a bee with unusual markings. So I grabbed my phone and quickly snapped a few pictures. And this was a bee that wasn't, it was so busy focused on the flowers that it didn't really pay too much attention to me. And I could get pretty close to it even with my phone. I had a funny feeling about this bee. It just didn't look like things that I'd seen before. And so I wondered if it could be, what was the chance, right? That it could be the bumblebee species I'd recently heard about in the news, the rusty patched bumblebee, which was federally listed as an endangered species in 2017. Yeah, I was just thinking, what's the possibility here? So I shared the photos with the Iowa DNR, and I received confirmation from experts at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that the bees were in fact rusty patched bumblebees. Then during a lab class that fall, after I talked about this with a UNI professor who taught conservation biology, the conservation biology students were visiting the Darrell Smith Prairie on the other side of the UNI campus. And some of them also made a confirmed sighting of rusty patched bumblebees. I still vividly remember Chan Dolan, one of those students, letting me know that she'd found one of these rusty patched bumblebees, and she was just beside herself with delight at having found this beautiful insect and this very rare insect on showy goldenrod right on the UNI campus. Our metro area has a well-deserved place as a high potential or red zone for the rusty patched bumblebee. These bees are active from April when the solitary queens emerge to start their colonies at about the same time that the bluebells are flowering in the woods, until October when the newly fertilized queens are using our asters and our goldenrod to fatten up for the winter so that they can survive somewhere burrowed up underneath the leaf litter. There are potentially 16 species of bumblebees found in Iowa, but several of these species are in decline. You can help them through sharing your observations through organizations like bumblebeewatch.org, by spreading the word to other people about their plight, by supporting conservation organizations, and even by planting diverse native flowering plants and shrubs in your own home landscape. As you can see from that map, many of the places where the rare RPBBs have been sighted, the rusty patch bumblebees, I've gotten on a first name basis with them, are in towns and cities. Even if more of us stopped using lawn chemicals that kill insects and wild flowering plants, we could make our cities a refuge for these beautiful and imperiled creatures. So keep your eyes out for rusty patch bumblebees and other species of bumbles that can be found in Iowa. With their plump, furry bodies and their bright markings, I think that they are the pandas of the prairie. Observing bumblebees on flowers is safe, as long as you don't harass them too much. Only females, the queens and the workers, can sting if they're provoked. That usually takes quite a lot, because when they're foraging, they're usually too busy to worry about you and your camera. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation provides great information for helping identify and conserve these important species. Iowa DNR has information for how you can help them, and you can share photos on bumblebeewatch.org to contribute to bee science and to get help with identification of your own photos. Beyond the bumbles, there are around 300 to 400 species of native bees in Iowa. Now, the one in this picture is not native. Honeybees are actually native to Eurasia and are basically farmed livestock here in North America. Our native bees differ from honeybees in many ways. Most of our native bees, well, none of our native bees live in hives. Some of them are social, but many of them are solitary. They range in color from gold to black, like these on a pale purple coneflower, to even striking metallic green, like this sweat bee that's feeding on mountain mint. Bees are highly effective pollinators because of their adaptations for carrying pollen. Some of that pollen gets transferred from flower to flower as they forage, helping plants to make seed. But the bees gather it for their own purpose, which is to feed their young. Bumblebees have flattened pollen baskets on their legs, and they carry pollen dough, which is pollen mixed with sweet nectar, just like honeybees, back to their own colonies. Now, what's funny about this picture is that this bee, which I think is actually rusty patch, is on a milkweed, which doesn't produce loose pollen. So the pollen that she's got in her pollen baskets is not from that plant. She's just stopping over there to get some more nectar because she needs that to energize her own flight. Our native bees have lots of different ways of carrying pollen, though this one is a native specialist on the woodland wildflower Spring Beauty, and her legs are loaded with bright pink pollen. And this bee on a pasture thistle is identifiable as a leaf-cutting bee because of the orange hairs you can see on its abdomen that are the ones that are adapted for carrying pollen. Unlike honeybees, most wild bees burrow into the ground to nest, or they borrow old rodent burrows, and some of them even nest inside hollow plant stems. When we were weeding a plot of pale purple coneflower this past summer, we noticed what looked like fine sawdust around some of the stems that were left from last year. When we opened up one of the stems to investigate, we found these chambers with bee larvae in them that were well supplied with a sticky dough made from pollen and nectar. Later in this season, I was really thrilled to observe a leaf-cutting bee actually carrying a cut little circle of leaf that it had folded up and tucked in between its legs so that it could help line the burrow in which it would lay its eggs and provision its offspring. Bees are the most specialized insect group for living on nectar and the pollen that flowers provide, but it's surprising to observe how many different kinds of insects visit flowers. Swamp milkweed is an important food plant for monarch caterpillars, but it also has flowers that smell like bubblegum and produce nectar that's like a candy store to large wasps. This cicada killer to me looks almost crazed with nectar lust. If you look closely at the feet and legs of the paper wasp in this picture, you can see that they are covered with the little pollen packets of the milkweed flowers. Here's one that had me seriously confused when I first observed it. So you notice that there's this large black wasp here that has a bright golden thorax. Well, that's what I noticed too. So I tried to identify the species online and I could find nothing like it. Just didn't exist. So of course, what happens when you can't figure something out online? Well, you go back and you observe it out in nature again. And when we looked at this closer, it revealed that the plant itself, dotted bee balm, has stamens that are like spring-loaded pollen poofs. When a wasp, one of these heavy-bodied great black wasps, lands on the lower lip of the flower, the stamens give it a solid whack on the back. Wasps that have visited several flowers look like they have a golden thorax. Turns out that these are the same great black wasps that visit swamp milkweed, but in disguise. If you want to observe pollinators, native wildflowers and shrubs are a great place to look. Some plants are standouts in terms of diversity and the sheer numbers of insects that they attract. I already mentioned Joe Pyeweed. Might I also suggest wild bergamot, also known as bee balm, which attracts bees, of course, but also moths like this white-lined sphinx and butterflies. How about meadow blazing star? I don't know what's in those flowers, but monarch butterflies just go crazy over it. There are at least 2 species of moths that are totally dependent on the species as well, and as well as other members of the same genus. Okay, this next one is one of my favorites. It's also a challenging one to observe. The bottle gentian is not a really common species, and it's relatively short compared to typical prairie vegetation in the fall. So you have to look pretty closely for it. It blooms very late in the season, so you'll see it in mid to late September. It's a beautiful color, but the flowers never fully open. It's one reason why it's called bottle gentian. So what can pollinate a flower that doesn't open up? Well, it's those big heavy-bodied prairie pandas. The smaller worker bumblebees, which are strong enough still to open up these flowers, fit down all the way into the flower. And it's really fun to watch how they wiggle around inside there. You'll just see that there's something going on inside the flower until they pop back out and go to the next one. Some of our native plants are misunderstood and unappreciated. The goldenrods, they often get blamed for hay fever just because they bloom at the same time as ragweed and have noticeable flowers. They're not giving you your itchy nose. They have sticky pollen and they attract beetles, bumblebees, and butterflies that share in the buffet of their pollen and nectar. Here there's a bit of a buffet going on here, and this is another one of those great black wasps, this time without the golden thorax. Another plant that gets a bad rap is the thistle. They're prickly, they tend to come up in places where they might have been heavily grazed or it might be a little bit disturbed. So they, people like to think that all thistles are weeds, but native species like this pasture thistle have beautiful flower heads that bloom late in the season and are visited by diverse pollinators. Thistles might not be like the best choice for your own lawn or garden, but the native species of thistle support not only pollinators, but they provide nutritious seeds and nest linings for our state bird, the American goldfinch. So you can see this male goldfinch is dipping his beak down into the bottom of that thistle head and pulling out the seeds. And then the goldfinches also use the fluff from those seeds to line their nests. It's one of the reasons why the goldfinch is one of the latest nesting birds in our state. This nest was actually, I took the picture of this nest at the same time I was taking pictures of those bottle gentians in September. And these the chicks had just hatched out in their thistle down lined nest. While we're on the subject of pollinators, there are a few observations that have challenged my understanding of plant biology entirely. If you've ever taken a biology course, you've probably learned about the ways plants and pollinators have co-evolved so that the adaptations of the insect partner match really well those of the plant partner. Each partner has something to gain. The insect gets food, the plant makes seed babies. Win-win. So for plants that don't use insects as pollen couriers, it doesn't make sense to invest in pretty flowers. Plants that use wind to carry their pollen have small, often drab and inconspicuous flowers that put out a lot of lightweight pollen. They're the ones that make sensitive human noses itch. And grasses fit into this wind pollinated category. So that's what I always thought. Until I had noticed that some grass flowers vary in color and some of them even have a smell. And over the past few years, I've observed that I'm not the only one who notices grass flowers. Tiny bees eat pollen from prairie cordgrass flowers, like the ones in this picture, and Sidote's grama grass. I couldn't find those pictures. The smelly flowers of prairie dropseed are attractive to hoverflies. It's still true that grasses are primarily wind pollinated, but I wonder how much grass pollen gets moved around by insect interactions. Does it help the plants set seed? Is it more important for certain grasses, like the ones that grow in specific patchy habitats? The categories we humans like to create help us to understand the world, but it's good to question them and keep asking questions. Nature blurs the boundaries of our concepts. Plants and animals don't follow our rules. They do what it takes to keep living and reproducing. Okay, so I remember there was a disclaimer. Here comes the gritty side of life. It's also kind of pretty in some places too. There's so much talk of pollinators these days, and it's with good reason. They not only have those interesting and intricate relationships with native plants, their work helps to create a healthy food supply for humans. Developing an appreciation for parasites and predators may be harder, but hang on there. I think you can do this. Being a parasite living on or in the body of another living thing is arguably the most common job description for any living thing. Everything gets parasites, even parasites themselves, and probably more than one. So the math tells us that they outnumber all the rest of us combined. It's not surprising then that some of what we see in our day-to-day work at the TPC are parasites. At the same time, parasites tend to be sneaky, disguised, or hidden inside things so that they may be hard to find and recognize. Some parasites are very deeply hidden. So these are rose seeds. They're harvested from inside the fruits of our state flower, the prairie wild rose. One day, my assistant and I noticed that some of the rose hips we harvested were shriveled and brown and not shiny and red. And we kind of had this question in the back of our minds, why? We kept the seeds separate and dissected a sample of each batch. Now, let me mention, these seeds are tough. And they're hard to cut into even with a razor blade. And this is what they look like when you have them under a dissecting microscope. But this is what a healthy seed looks like. You can see it kind of looks almost like a sunflower seed, and it fills up the inside of that really tough coat. About 40% of the seeds from the shriveled brown hips, though, didn't have that plump seed in them. They had a wriggling larva. So we took these larvae, the seeds, with the larvae inside them and put them inside a rearing chamber. It was basically a plastic jar with cloth over the top. And within a few weeks, we found tiny wasps with these delicate shimmering wings inside the rearing cage. The grid behind this little guy is 5 millimeters. So you can see he's only about 3 millimeters long from stem to stern. We finally identified these as rose seed chalcid wasps. We're still learning more about their biology, and we're hoping to thereby figure out how we can produce more healthy seed from our prairie roses. Some parasites aren't as well hidden as these chalcid wasps, though. Some of them are right out in the open if you know what to look for. One morning, we found flies perched strangely at the tops of sedge stems in one of our seed production plots. A close look revealed that the flies were dead, and the reason why. These flies had been infected with a parasitic insect-eating fungus that turns them into fly zombies. Once the fungus is ready to emerge, it forces its host to climb to the top of the nearest plant and lift its wings to release the fungal spores. So these fungi are specific to their host. They don't pose any danger to us as humans, and they probably help to regulate those insect populations. Now you can see at the top of one of these stems, there's this beautifully colored little hoverfly. I tried to warn it, stay away, but unfortunately it probably also got infected and turned into a zombie itself. One of the other things that regulates insect populations is their predators. These could be birds or mammals, but the ones we see most often when we're hunkered down in the plots are other arthropods, and we're often glad to see them. We struggle to protect our swamp milkweed plants from invasive oleander aphids. These are the bright orange sap-sucking insects that you can see kind of in the background of this photo, a little bit out of focus. The things in the foreground are the seeds, they are the eggs of green lacewing insects on their little stalks. These are a welcome sight. When the mottled brown larvae come out, they are fierce aphid predators, just like ladybug beetles are. We often see black and yellow argiope or banded argiope spiders in their webs in fall. They have this characteristic zigzag marking that really shows up in the shadow of this picture. By this time of the season, these spiders are good sized and they can tackle strong, heavy prey like grasshoppers and even honeybees. My favorites, though, I think have to be the jumping spiders. When I see one, I kind of go, I squeal and dance around and get all excited. I haven't learned to identify them to their species, but I've noticed several different kinds in the prairie. This one is just a very pale colored one that was on a prairie sage plant. They don't spin webs like the argiope spiders do, but they use their silk like a rock climber's ropes. They have great eyesight. They often look like they're looking straight at you, and they stalk their prey and then pounce. They remind me of like tiny furry 8-legged kittens. In the greenhouse last year, we had a large, bold jumping spider, Phidippus audax, that became like a pet. If we wiggled our fingers near it, it would hop right under our hands. And so we tried this out with a couple of us just playing with that same little spider. I've never been bitten by a jumping spider, and I've been handling them since I was a small child. Jumping spiders often wait in flowers, and they'll prey on some of the smaller pollinators. Some of them get away, like this one did, and some don't. And sometimes the jumpers tackle other small prey, like this one has a little beetle. And sometimes they take down insects that are even larger than themselves. In the fall, as the frost hits and harvest comes and goes, we see fewer insects or spiders, and we spend less time in the field. Occasionally, we still find something new and exciting. One fall, we were cutting shrubs from a retired production plot when my assistant noticed a dead frog hanging from a sharp twig. We left that shrub in place and kept a lookout for an unusual bird. A couple of weeks later, we saw it. A northern shrike, a predatory songbird that catches small mammals, amphibians, reptiles, or insects, and hangs some of its prey on thorns, sharp sticks, or barbed wire. We had found a shrike's pantry. Sometimes, as people, we are disturbed a little bit by the actions of predators. But to me, I'm excited to see that this unusual predator can survive in the habitats around the Tallgrass Prairie Center. To me, it tells us that what we're doing is supporting an ecosystem that has enough plant diversity, enough plant foods to support those herbivorous creatures that then provide the food for these predators. So it's not something that disturbs me. It's something that tells me that there's health in this system. In the winter, we occasionally check on the plots, even when it's cold and snowy. Things seem quiet this time of year, but we can see evidence of activity in the tracks and the signs that are left in the snow. Some of the tracks are common and easy to read, like rabbit trails, but a neat hole leading into a grass clump could be the entrance to a vole's tunnels, like the ones that trace along this path. They live down in the insulated space under the snow during the winter. A coyote often patrols the edges of our plots, using our mowed trails for easy loping and access to the numerous rabbits and voles. Little piles of grass seeds, cross-hatched by narrow toes, show where small songbirds like American tree sparrows have feasted on the seeds of prairie grasses and wildflowers. I'm going to leave you with this thought. The things that we've seen at the TPC aren't unusual or inaccessible. Nature and its observation are available to all of us, even during a pandemic. Go outside, explore your own backyard or neighborhood, visit a park, take a hike at Hartman or one of the public trails on the UNI campus, including at the TPC. Slow down, take time, look closely. Find the small things, see what they're doing, ask questions. I hope that you'll be as surprised as I am every time. If you'd like to learn more about being an amateur naturalist or community scientist, I'd suggest a lot of wonderful resources are available online as well. You can visit our website, tallgrassprairiecenter.org. There you can find my contact information. I welcome your questions on my email, or you can call me by phone. I'd also recommend iowaprairienetwork.org for work on advocacy and providing information about prairies, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, bumblebeewatch.org, your local chapter of the National Audubon Society, and the iNaturalist phone app, which is really fun for learning more about what you see outside. Finally, one more plug for the Tallgrass Prairie Center and our website and some of the things that you can find there. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I think Connie might have some questions for me. I'll open that up to Connie.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I was just smiling the whole time. It's just a wonderful, wonderful resource for Iowa and actually the whole world. Of course, people might be wondering if you have a gift shop where you can sell the Ecotype seed.
That's a really, really good question. We do not sell seed directly to the public. So our role is to support the development of that Iowa source native seed market. So our seed goes out to native seed growers who then produce it at quantity and can sell it. We do have a listing on our website of seed and service providers. And there's also a link on our website to a thing called Plant Iowa Native, and that also has resources for finding out where you can find local source native seed and plants. I'd also just encourage you to find out who are the native plant growers in your area. And I think there, when you work with a local native seed grower or native plant grower, then you're more likely to be able to find out how they grow their plants and seed, if they're doing so with pollinator friendly practices, and also where that seed has its genetic origin. Is it really adapted to and appropriate for your region? So I encourage you to contact a local native seed and plant grower. Sometimes they sell plants through farmers markets and the like. Many of them also have websites. So please check them out.
Okay. Do you have any annual events, public events?
We generally have a speaker series in the spring that brings people in to talk about restoration and prairie management topics. We periodically have field days that are focused on specific restoration topics and audiences. And we do post information about our events on our website, tallgrassprairiecenter.org. So if you're interested, you can see our events calendar on that page. I believe sometime this spring, we may have an event to kind of publicize the availability of the trails that run through the UNI campus grounds that we manage. And so keep your eyes peeled for that. That would involve having Tallgrass Prairie Center staff and AmeriCorps service members stationed around the grounds to answer your questions and help you find out how you can do some of the exploration that I get to do every day.
Nice, nice. So if anybody else has any other questions, Laura would be happy to talk with you or to exchange email with you. Her email address is laura.walter@uni.edu. And her telephone number is 319-273-3005.
Perfect. I'd like to remind people, it's also, if you go to the staff directory on the tallgrassprairiecenter.org, that information is also available there if you didn't get it jotted down this time.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Laura. Always good to see you. You're definitely
Connie.
a friend of Hartman Reserve, definitely. Big F and little F. And thanks for everybody else who joined us here today at our second Sunday speaker series. Our next speaker series is going to be March 14th, and we're going to be celebrating March Maple Madness all through the month of March. And so March 14th is going to be what else about maple syrup. So we'll have Cletus Wander in our sugar shack, and he'll talk to you all about the processing of maple syrup. Looking forward to seeing you again, and thanks again for your support of conservation. Goodbye.